"Send me back," the dragon bride said quietly, not in defiance, not in anger, but with fear pressed so deep into her voice it barely surfaced. Because this marriage was never meant to be a union. It was a transaction. And she had already decided she would rather face exile than let her son grow up owned by a contract. But before anyone could respond, the small human boy at her side stepped forward, took her clawed hand, and said something that shifted the room. My mother already chose him. And if this kind of human-centered science fiction story where choice breaks galactic systems is your thing, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments whose side you think the galaxy will choose before the story continues. This is a HFY science fiction story about a dragon woman sold as a bride, a child who refuses to be traded, and a human who becomes dangerous. Not because of strength or status, but because he stands where the galaxy expects obedience. A story where contracts collide with family, power is redefined, and one quiet decision begins a chain reaction no empire was prepared for. The marriage chamber had been designed to intimidate humans. High ceilings carved from black alloy stone, heat vents glowing faintly red along the walls, and banners of the Drakari houses hanging like warnings instead of decorations, yet none of it was aimed at the man standing at the center of the room. It was all meant for the woman beside him, the dragon bride whose scales reflected the light in muted bronze and crimson tones, her wings folded tight against her back, not in submission, but in restraint, because every instinct in her body was screaming that this place was a trap she had already stepped too far into. She had crossed 3 systems to get here, signed with a blood seal older than most star maps, and accepted the title of bride, not because she wanted power or alliance, but because the contract promised safety for her son, and that promise was the only thing that had mattered to her since the night her clutch was burned, and her world was declared strategically unnecessary by the same council now watching her from elevated seats. The human groom stood quietly, hands at his sides, no armor, no ceremonial weapon, no noble markings beyond the simple insignia of Earth's interstellar envoy, and that alone unsettled the observers more than if he had arrived bristling with guns. Humans were unpredictable when they looked unarmed, and this one looked calm in a way that suggested he did not feel smaller in a room full of dragons. The officiator, a scaled elder with eyes like molten gold, began reciting the binding clauses of the union, terms of asset transfer, lineage rights, future offspring classification, and it was there, buried between legal phrases spoken like scripture, that the dragon woman finally understood what they had hidden in the fine print. Her son would not be raised as Drakari. He would be designated auxiliary blood, a dependent, property tied to the house rather than family protected by it. Her claws tightened reflexively, stone beneath her feet cracking just enough for the sound to echo, and the room paused, every eye shifting toward her as she took a slow breath and did something no contract bride had ever done before. She interrupted the ceremony. "Send me back," she said, voice low but steady, forcing the words past tradition and threat. "I will accept exile. I will accept dishonor. But my son will not grow up owned by signatures he never agreed to." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, outrage from the houses, shock from the council, quiet calculation from military observers, because a rejected bride meant broken treaties, and broken treaties led to wars. Yet before the officiator could respond, before guards could move, a small human-shaped figure stepped out from behind the dragon woman's wing. Her son was not supposed to speak. He was not even supposed to be standing. Children did not address councils. But he moved anyway, small fingers wrapping around her clawed hand with certainty rather than fear. And he looked up not at the dragons, not at the human envoy, but at the contract seal hovering in the air between them. "My mother already chose him," the boy said, voice clear enough to carry. And something about the way he said it made the room feel suddenly smaller, like The laws that had ruled it for centuries had just been challenged by something they had forgotten to account for. That was when the scanners activated, not the ceremonial ones, but the silent evaluators embedded in the chamber walls. Systems designed to analyze bloodlines, compatibility, compliance probability, and future risk. And as they swept over the child, over the dragon woman, and finally over the human groom, a warning flickered across a display that no one else could see yet, a deviation marker that suggested this marriage was no longer a simple exchange. It was the first sign that the galaxy had misjudged what it was trying to control. The scanners did not announce themselves. There was no dramatic flare of light or warning tone, just a subtle shift in the air as the chamber's embedded systems recalibrated, drawing power from deeper reserves. Focusing not on lineage prestige or ceremonial compatibility, but on something far more dangerous to an empire built on certainty, anomaly detection. And while the elders continued murmuring among themselves, unaware that a different evaluation had already begun, the dragon woman felt it immediately. The faint prickle along her scales, the pressure behind her eyes, the unmistakable sensation of being measured in ways no contract had prepared her for. Across the chamber, hidden panels slid open with the quiet efficiency of military design, releasing streams of data that flowed across private displays reserved for ranking observers only. Genetic resonance, adaptive probability curves, behavioral deviation forecasts, and one line that caused several council members to stiffen in their seats. Human influence vector detected, escalation potential unbounded, and for the first time in generations, a Drakari union was being assessed not for political gain, but for risk. The human groom noticed the change before anyone spoke, not because he could see the data, but because he had lived his entire career reading rooms where power shifted without permission. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes tracked the subtle movements of guards repositioning, the tightening of claws around ceremonial staves, the way the officiator's voice faltered for half a second before resuming. And when the elder finally paused, gaze settling on the child still gripping his mother's hand, it was no longer with irritation, but with something closer to concern. "Child," the elder said carefully, choosing the universal trade dialect instead of Drakari high speech, a concession that did not go unnoticed. "You do not have standing in this matter." Yet the boy did not release his grip, did not lower his eyes, and when he spoke again, he did not raise his voice. He simply answered as if the concept of standing meant nothing to him at all. "I know," he said, "but you are deciding what happens to us like we are cargo. I wanted to make sure you heard me before you finished." The word cargo hit the chamber harder than any shout because it was accurate, because every system in the room knew it, and because humans had a habit of naming uncomfortable truths without asking permission first. A habit that had started wars and ended empires more than once. The dragon woman felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to hope, because in that moment she realized her son was not reacting out of panic or confusion. He was assessing, learning, adapting the same traits that had once made the Drakari feared across star systems, traits that had been slowly regulated out of their society in favor of predictability and control. One of the military observers finally spoke, breaking protocol in a way that suggested urgency was overriding tradition. "The scan is not complete," he said, voice clipped. "We are detecting cross-species behavioral reinforcement, the child's response patterns are aligning with human stress adaptation models," and several heads turned sharply toward the human groom, who met their stares without flinching. "That is not something you can legislate away," he said calmly, "not as a threat, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. Humans teach their children to choose, even when the choices scare us, especially then." Silence followed, thick and uneasy, because the council understood what that meant. Choice led to unpredictability. Unpredictability led to resistance, and resistance was the one variable their empire had never successfully contained. And as the scanners continued to hum, recalculating outcomes that no longer fit within acceptable parameters, the realization began to spread through the chamber that this marriage was no longer about alliance or diplomacy. It was about what happened when a system designed to own futures encountered a family that refused to surrender theirs. The council attempted to regain control the only way it knew how, by reframing the situation as procedure rather than consequence, by reminding themselves that entire civilizations had been shaped by contracts written in rooms exactly like this. 1. And so the high officiator straightened, spreading his wings just enough to command attention, announcing that the union process would proceed to the compliance phase. A phrase that meant the dragon bride would be formally bound, the child reassigned to imperial guardianship until maturity, and the human dismissed with compensation and memory sealing if required. It was clean, efficient, and catastrophically misjudged. The moment the word reassigned echoed through the chamber, the boy finally let go of his mother's hand, not to step back, but to step forward, placing himself squarely between her and the officials, his shoulders squared in a way that made several veterans of border conflicts feel unexpectedly uneasy, because they had seen that stance before on human soldiers who had already accepted that retreat was not an option. The dragon woman inhaled sharply, instinct screaming at her to pull him back. But something stopped her, something deeper than fear, because for the first time since she had been labeled property, someone was choosing her without being ordered to. The scanners reacted instantly, like patterns spiking, data streams accelerating, and a warning indicator flashed across restricted channels. Emergent authority behavior detected. Probability cascade unstable, while the human groom moved as, well, not toward the boy, but to stand beside him. A deliberate choice that reframed the image now burned into every recording device in the room. A human and a hybrid child standing together in front of an empire that had assumed neither would ever say no. "You do not get to take him," the human said evenly, his voice carrying without amplification. "Not today, not ever." And when a security unit took a step forward, the boy looked up at them and smiled, not bravely, not defiantly, but with the unsettling calm of someone who had already decided how this ended. The dragon elders felt it then, a subtle but undeniable shift in the air, the way the chamber's ancient predictive systems hesitated, unable to lock onto a future that suddenly contained too many branching paths, and somewhere deep in the imperial network, a classification tag updated itself without permission. Human-bonded units, high risk, observation priority elevated, because the Empire was beginning to understand a lesson humanity had learned long ago. That family was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a force that rewrote rules, broke chains, and when threatened, refused to behave in ways anyone could safely predict. What followed was not violence, and that unsettled the council far more than any outburst could have, because empires were built to respond to rebellion, not to refusal that stayed calm and immovable. The high officiator attempted to speak again, but the words felt thin, even as they left his mouth. Legal phrases about jurisdiction and heritage that had once ended wars before they began, yet now seemed to slide off the moment like water off polished stone. The human did not raise his voice, did not threaten. He simply kept his position, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, a gesture so ordinary and protective that it disrupted centuries of hierarchical logic, because ownership did not look like that, and obedience never had. The dragon bride felt her wings tremble, not with fear this time, but with something dangerously close to relief, and she realized the truth with a clarity that stole her breath. She had been prepared to endure anything for her son, but she had never imagined someone else would stand with them by choice. Across the chamber, security units adjusted their stances, not advancing, not retreating, waiting for an order that did not come, because the predictive engines behind their visors were feeding them conflicting outcomes, every scenario branching into unacceptable loss. The Council's oldest archivist quietly accessed the deep records, pulling forgotten case studies from the earliest days of contact with humanity. Incidents where human civilians had disrupted containment operations simply by refusing to comply, in ways that logic could not resolve, and his expression darkened as he recognized the pattern forming again. The child looked up at his mother then, his eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting lights, and spoke softly, telling her he was not afraid, telling her he liked the human, telling her he had chosen already, and the simplicity of it cut through layers of protocol like a blade. The Dragon Elders felt the chamber's authority slipping, not seized, not overthrown, but quietly rendered irrelevant, as if the future had stepped sideways just enough to avoid them entirely. Somewhere within the Imperial systems, another alert triggered. This one never meant to activate in a negotiation chamber. Social contract override detected. Participant agency exceeding model parameters, and for the first time in generations. The Empire faced a truth it had no clean answer for, that this was no longer a transaction to be managed, but a family forming in real time. And once humans decided something was family, history suggested there would be consequences for anyone who tried to take it away. The Council recessed under the guise of deliberation, but everyone in the chamber understood the truth. They were retreating, buying time, hoping the moment would cool and return to something manageable, something procedural. The human remained where he was, seated beside the Dragon Bride and her son in a holding chamber designed for temporary cargo disputes, its walls smooth and neutral, stripped of cultural markers so no species could claim advantage. That design choice backfired almost immediately, because in the absence of symbols, the only thing left to define the space was behavior, and the human filled it with quiet normalcy. He asked the boy if he was hungry, if he wanted water, if he needed to rest. Questions so mundane they felt almost subversive in a place accustomed to contracts and classifications. The Dragon Bride watched closely, her instincts screaming for danger while her senses found none. No coercion, no dominance, no hidden claim being staked, just presence. She realized with a jolt that this was what unsettled her the most. The human was not trying to win anything. He was acting as if the outcome was already decided. Outside the chamber, observers argued in hushed tones, analysts projecting futures that spiraled wildly depending on one variable they could not quantify: human persistence. The boy leaned against the human side without hesitation, small, claws resting on fabric, grounding himself, and something ancient in the Dragon Bride stirred, a memory older than empire, when bonds were chosen in fire and loyalty mattered more than lineage. She spoke at last, asking the human why he stayed, why he challenged a system that could crush him without effort. And he answered simply that leaving would have been easier, and that was reason enough not to. Those words echoed far beyond the room, slipping into surveillance logs, analyst briefings, and emergency advisories, because ease had always been the Empire's measure of compliance, and here was a species that distrusted ease on principle. When the Council reconvened, their tone had changed, cautious now, layered with forced respect, offering revised terms, expanded guardianship clauses, supervised integration, anything that framed the situation as a controlled exception. The human listened, nodded, and declined, not angrily, not dismissively, just firmly, explaining that families did not function under supervision and children did not thrive as compromises. Silence followed, heavy and spreading, because no one in that room could argue the logic without sounding monstrous. Deep within Imperial space, a new directive began drafting itself without authorization. Cross-species kinship anomaly observed. Recommend non-interference pending further study. And for the first time since first contact, The Empire's greatest defense systems shifted from containment to observation. The delay stretched longer than anyone expected. Not minutes, but cycles. Long enough for the holding chamber to feel less like a temporary space and more like a place where decisions quietly solidified. The Empire prided itself on swift resolutions. Yet here it hesitated, because every projection it ran kept looping back to the same unresolved variable: the human's refusal to behave as predicted. The Dragon Bride sensed the shift before it was announced, the subtle change in the air. The way distant engines powered down instead of up. The absence of guards outside the chamber doors. This was not an escalation. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty terrified empires far more than rebellion. The boy had fallen asleep against the human's shoulder, slow breaths fogging the air in soft puffs of warmth, and the human did not move. Even when his arm grew stiff, even when discomfort set in, because waking the child felt like crossing a line he refused to approach. The Dragon Bride watched this small act of restraint and felt something crack inside her, a belief she had carried her entire life. That power always demanded proof, that dominance always required display. Here was a being from a species labeled fragile, volatile, barely space-worthy, proving loyalty without spectacle. Outside, a delegation of elder dragons arrived unannounced, their presence alone enough to warp the political gravity of the station, their scales marked with the symbols of lineage and conquest. They demanded access, demanded explanations, demanded to know why a contract had been allowed to unravel so publicly. When they were shown the recordings, not the council speeches, but the quiet moments, the child's choice, the human stillness, the lack of fear, their reactions were not what the council anticipated. One elder turned away first, muttering that this was old magic wearing new skin. Another noted that bonds formed under no coercion were the hardest to break. And a third asked the question no one else dared: what happens if we force separation, and the child refuses to survive it? That question echoed through every chamber of authority, because survival had always been the Empire's ultimate metric. And here was a scenario where survival itself became conditional on mercy. When the council finally issued its interim ruling, it was framed as a temporary allowance, a cultural observation period. But everyone understood its significance. The human would remain, the child would not be removed, and the Dragon Bride's request for return was officially suspended pending her own consent. She heard the ruling in silence, then corrected them calmly, stating that her consent was no longer pending. It had been decided the moment her son chose. The human looked at her then, surprised, not triumphant, and nodded once, accepting her decision as if it had always been hers to make. Somewhere far beyond the station, in the quiet archives of First Contact Doctrine, a new annotation was added beside humanity's profile: emotional anchoring effect observed. Potential destabilization of hierarchical bonding models. Proceed with caution. And for the first time, the Empire did not ask what humans wanted. It asked what they would protect and whether the galaxy was ready for the answer. The days that followed did not feel like days at all, more like a slow recalibration of reality, as if the station itself was trying to decide which rules still applied and which ones had quietly expired. The human was no longer treated like cargo or guest or threat, but something far more uncomfortable for an empire built on categories: an exception. He noticed it in small ways, how guards no longer blocked his path but adjusted their stance when he passed, how officers paused before issuing commands in his presence, how conversations lowered in volume instead of cutting off entirely. None of it felt like respect in the way humans understood it, but it felt like recognition, and that carried its own weight. The Dragon Bride remained by his side, not out of obligation now, but choice, a word that still felt strange in her mouth, heavy and unfamiliar, yet impossible to put down once she had spoken it. She began teaching him things the contract had. Never required. Fragments of dragon language meant only for kin. The meaning behind scale markings, the way dragons measured time not in years, but in bonds kept and broken. In return, he taught her things just as dangerous. The human habit of questioning authority without challenging it directly. The art of standing still and forcing others to make the next move. The quiet power of refusing to escalate. The child listened to everything, absorbing it with the effortless adaptability that had first drawn the scanner's attention, switching between cultures without friction, as if he had always belonged in the space between worlds. Beyond the station, the consequences rippled outward. Merchant guilds delayed shipments, waiting to see if trade routes would remain stable. Border fleets adjusted patrol patterns, not because of an external threat, but because internal cohesion had become uncertain. Whispers spread through diplomatic channels about a human who had altered a dragon lineage without force, about a child whose choice had overridden contracts older than some star systems. Some called it a fluke, others a warning. A few recognized it for what it truly was, a precedent. The Empire convened emergency councils not to punish, but to predict, running simulations that grew more erratic with each iteration. Every model that involved coercion ended in loss. Every attempt to reassert dominance fractured alliances, and every scenario that allowed the bond to remain intact resulted in something no empire had ever planned for: shared loyalty. The elders argued, scholars debated, strategists grew uneasy, because shared loyalty could not be taxed, commanded, or weaponized without consequence. Meanwhile, the human remained frustratingly ordinary in his behavior, eating when hungry, resting when tired, asking practical questions instead of grand ones, treating the station like a place to live rather than a stage for history. That ordinariness unsettled them more than defiance ever could, because it suggested this outcome had never required extraordinary intent, only consistency. The Dragon Bride began to understand something her people rarely admitted. That strength did not always announce itself with fire or flight. Sometimes it arrived quietly and refused to leave. She watched the human interact with her son, not as a symbol or political variable, but as a child who needed patience, boundaries, and the freedom to make small mistakes without fear of punishment. That alone began to shift her instincts, centuries of inherited doctrine loosening their grip. When an imperial envoy finally arrived to formalize the situation, armed with language designed to preserve authority while conceding ground, the Dragon Bride surprised everyone by taking the lead. She spoke calmly, without challenge or submission, stating that any future arrangement would recognize the bond already formed, that her son's autonomy was not negotiable, and that any attempt to undo it would be met not with rebellion, but withdrawal. Dragons understood withdrawal as a last resort, a severing of shared fate, and the room chilled at the implication. The human said nothing, did nothing, and that silence carried more weight than any threat. By the time the envoy departed, it was clear that the Empire had not lost control in a dramatic collapse. It had lost it the way all rigid systems eventually do, quietly, incrementally, to something more flexible, more human than it had planned for. The shift became undeniable the moment the station's core, council chambers, opened their doors to outsiders for the first time in generations. What had once been a sealed arena of authority now echoed with unfamiliar voices, accents from trade, worlds, frontier colonies, and even a handful of independent systems that usually avoided imperial space altogether. Officially, the gathering was labeled a status review, but everyone present understood the truth. The Empire was no longer reviewing a situation, it was reacting to it. The human's presence had become a fixed variable in every equation, and no amount of political language could remove him without unraveling the structure built around him. He stood at the back of the chamber with the Dragon Bride and her son, not as a defendant or guest of honor, but as an anchor point, someone the room kept unconsciously orienting toward. When discussions grew heated, eyes flicked his way, as if measuring whether their words crossed an invisible line. That alone unsettled the elders more than any open challenge could have. Power, they realized too late, was shifting without ceremony, without banners, without war, and there was no protocol for reversing that kind of momentum. The dragon child sensed it too, though he lacked the vocabulary to explain it. He only knew that adults spoke more carefully now, that directives came with pauses instead of commands, that even the most imposing figures hesitated when he looked at them directly. His choice had not just altered his own future, it had exposed a flaw in the Empire's foundation, the assumption that authority flowed in one direction. Children were supposed to inherit systems, not reshape them. Yet here he was, living proof that allegiance chosen freely carried more weight than obedience. Enforced. The Dragon Bride watched this unfold with a mixture of pride and quiet fear, because she understood the danger of becoming a symbol. Dragons had long memories, but empires had even longer grudges, and precedent was a thing they never forgave. Lightly, she began preparing contingencies without announcing them, subtle arrangements with neutral systems, quiet agreements for passage, fallback sanctuaries that could vanish into uncharted space if needed. The human noticed, of course, but he did not question her, understanding instinctively that preparation was not the same as paranoia. It was simply survival done politely. Outside the council chamber, the galaxy adjusted in subtler ways. Recruitment. Numbers dipped as conscripts questioned contracts that treated loyalty like a commodity. Trade guilds started inserting new clauses into agreements, language emphasizing mutual benefit over enforced compliance. Even the Imperial Academies saw a shift, instructors fielding questions they had never been trained to answer, about consent, about obligation, about what happened when a subordinate said no, and the universe did not immediately collapse. None of these changes were attributed publicly to the human or the dragon child, but everyone knew where the fracture had started. The Empire's own data analysts flagged a pattern they could not suppress, cultural drift accelerating along lines. A voluntary association. That terrified them because drift could not be countered with fleets or sanctions, only adaptation, and adaptation required humility. When the final report of the day reached the highest authority node, its conclusion was brief and deeply unsettling. Containment is no longer possible. Influence has become diffuse. The node processed that statement for several cycles longer than normal, because for the first time in its recorded existence, the Empire was facing a future it could not dominate, only participate in. The consequences of that realization did not arrive with explosions or open rebellion. They arrived quietly, through hesitation. Orders that would once have been executed instantly now stalled in review queues. Commanders reread directives twice, before forwarding them, not out of fear of punishment, but fear of consequence. Somewhere along the chain of authority, people had started asking themselves a dangerous question. Not, can we do this, but should we? That question spread faster than any virus the Empire had ever tried to contain. A human felt it most clearly in the small things. Guards who no longer barked instructions, but spoke in measured tones. Administrators who asked for confirmation. Instead of issuing ultimatums, officials who made room at tables that had never been shared before. None of them openly acknowledged why they were behaving differently, but the shift was undeniable. Power that had once relied on inevitability was now forced to negotiate, and negotiation changed everything. The Dragon Bride watched the Empire struggle with this new reality and understood the danger better than most. Empires did not collapse because of external enemies as often as they did from internal contradiction, and this one was now contradicting itself daily. It still claimed absolute authority, yet it was beginning to respect choice, a concept fundamentally incompatible with domination. She counseled patience, reminding the human that systems under stress often lashed out before they learned restraint. Her people had seen it before, civilizations that reached for brute force when persuasion failed, mistaking control for stability. The human listened, but he also saw something she did not fully expect. A genuine curiosity emerging among younger officials and mid-level leaders, individuals who had grown up believing the empire was immutable and were now witnessing proof that it could change. Those people did not want to burn the system down. They wanted to understand how it could bend without breaking, and that made them potential allies rather than inevitable enemies. Meanwhile, beyond imperial space, rumors traveled faster than official statements ever could. Traders spoke of a dragon child who had chosen his own guardian and an empire that had been forced to accept it. Frontier worlds whispered that if the most rigid power structure in the known galaxy could be compelled to respect consent, then perhaps other injustices were not as permanent as they had been taught to believe. Some stories exaggerated wildly, painting the human as a conqueror or the child as a living weapon. But even those distortions carried the same core message. The old rules were no longer absolute. Pirate enclaves, neutral coalitions, and even isolationist species began watching imperial channels more closely, not for signs of aggression, but for signs of weakness or growth. Both were equally valuable intelligence. At the heart of it all, the dragon child began to change in ways that surprised everyone, including his mother. He grew more confident, not arrogant, but assured in the knowledge that his voice mattered. He asked questions adults struggled to answer about why some beings were allowed to choose their paths while others were assigned theirs, about why loyalty was praised in some contexts and punished in others. The human answered honestly when he could and admitted ignorance when he could not, which only deepened the child's trust. That relationship became a quiet blueprint for something radical, authority built on guidance rather than fear, protection, offered without ownership. Observers noted the bond with increasing unease, because it demonstrated a model that could not be easily replicated by institutions, only by individuals willing to relinquish control. By the end of the cycle, the empire's strategic models began producing results that no longer aligned with historical data. Predictions of compliance faltered, suppression scenarios failed to converge, and influence projections scattered into ranges too broad to act upon decisively. One analyst summarized it in a private note that never reached official channels. The empire is no longer the center of gravity in its own territory. That statement, had it been acknowledged, would have triggered emergency protocols, but it was quietly archived instead. Somewhere between denial and acceptance, the system hesitated, and in that hesitation, something unprecedented took root. For the first time, the future was not being dictated from the top down. It was being negotiated in real time, and no one could say for certain where it would lead. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check. The turning point did not come from the throne, nor from the military councils that still pretended to command the direction of events. It came from the margins, from a decision so small it almost went unnoticed at first. A junior magistrate, tasked with reviewing cross-species family statutes, issued a provisional clarification stating that chosen guardianship, when initiated by a dependent of sound cognitive development, could not be overridden without demonstrable harm. It was meant to apply only to a narrow set of cases, a legal patch to avoid future procedural confusion, but its implications rippled outward immediately. The dragon child situation was no longer an exception managed behind closed doors. It was precedent. Once precedent existed, others could invoke it, and once others invoked it, the empire would have to respond publicly rather than quietly adjusting behind the scenes. The response was predictably fractured. Traditionalists within the empire condemned the clarification as reckless, arguing that it weakened hierarchical stability and encouraged emotional decision-making. Reformists countered that stability built on forced compliance was already proving fragile, and that legitimacy required at least the appearance of consent. The human watched these debates unfold through filtered briefings and leaked transcripts, struck by how often his name surfaced as a symbol rather than a person. To some, he represented dangerous unpredictability, proof that humans destabilize systems simply by existing within them. To others, he was evidence that the empire had misjudged an entire species by reducing them to labor metrics and compliance scores. Neither side truly understood him, but both were forced to account for him, and that alone marked a shift in power dynamics. The Dragon Bride understood the stakes better than anyone else in the room when she was summoned before a joint advisory council. She did not plead or threaten, she explained. She spoke of her people's long history with empires that believed strength justified entitlement, and of how those empires eventually collapsed under the weight of their own rigidity. She described dragons not as conquerors or symbols, but as families, bound by choice as much as blood, where forced allegiance was considered a kind of spiritual failure. When she spoke of her son, she did not frame him as a political factor, but as a child learning what kind of universe he lived in. By the time she finished, the chamber was quiet, not because she had convinced them, but because she had removed their ability to simplify the issue. Outside official chambers, the social consequences accelerated. Civilian networks lit up with debates about choice, guardianship, and autonomy, topics that had once been considered abstract philosophy, but were now anchored to a living example. Artists depicted the dragon child and the human in murals, and data vids, sometimes inaccurately, but always with emphasis on connection rather than dominance. Educational forums quietly updated curricula to include case studies on cross-species ethics, careful not to reference current events explicitly, yet clearly inspired by them. Even within the military, training simulations began incorporating scenarios where cooperation replaced suppression as the optimal outcome, not because command ordered it, but because instructors recognized reality adapting faster than doctrine. For the human, the weight of it all became heavier than any official scrutiny. He had not sought to become a symbol, yet he now carried the burden of representing an alternative way of relating to power. He worried about failure, not personal failure, but the kind that would confirm every fear the empire held about granting choice. The Dragon Bride reminded him that responsibility did not mean perfection, it meant consistency. Showing up, listening, and refusing to treat another being as property were not heroic acts. They were basic ones, and that simplicity was what made them threatening to systems built on control. The child, blissfully unaware of the full scope of the consequences, continued to ask questions, continued to choose curiosity over fear, and in doing so, continued to erode assumptions no one had realized were so brittle. By the end of that period, a classified report circulated among the highest levels of imperial oversight. It did not recommend retaliation or containment. Instead, it posed a risk assessment unlike any before it, stating that the greatest destabilizing factor was not the human, the dragon, or even their bond, but the observable effect of voluntary allegiance on dependent populations. The report concluded with a line that unsettled everyone who read it. Forced loyalty decays over time. Chosen loyalty strengthens. No countermeasure was proposed because none existed. For an empire that had always relied on inevitability, the emergence of choice was not just a challenge. It was an existential question, one it could no longer ignore. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check. The empire's attempt to regain narrative control began quietly, through language rather than force. Official bulletins stopped referring to the situation as a legal anomaly and instead labeled it a cultural adjustment period, a phrase vague enough to sound temporary and harmless. Committees were formed, subcommittees branched off, and timelines were proposed that pushed any binding decision further into the future. To an outside observer, it looked like patience, but to those paying attention, it was hesitation. Delay had always been the Empire's safest weapon, but this time, delay worked against it, because the idea had already escaped containment. People were not waiting for permission anymore. They were already discussing what choice meant in their own lives. Within the residential arc, where the human and the dragon child lived, changes unfolded in subtle but undeniable ways. Neighbors, who had once offered polite distance, now stopped to ask questions, not invasive ones, but genuine, curious ones. They wanted to know how communication worked, how boundaries were set, how conflicts were resolved when biology and culture diverged. So sharply, the human answered honestly, admitting uncertainty where it existed, explaining routines where they had formed. The dragon child often joined in, correcting adults with the blunt confidence only children possess, stating simply that he chose where he felt safe and that no one had made him do so. Those conversations traveled further than any official broadcast, because they sounded real, not managed. The Dragon Bride, once viewed primarily as a diplomatic complication, found herself becoming something else entirely, a reference point. Other cross-species families, long hidden within the margins of the Empire, began reaching out to her quietly. Some had complied with imposed arrangements for decades, believing resistance futile or dangerous. Others had lost children to relocation programs they were never allowed to contest. She listened to every story, absorbing them with a composure shaped by centuries of lived experience. What disturbed her most was not the cruelty of the systems described, but how normalized the cruelty had become. People had learned to frame injustice as efficiency, and in doing so had surrendered the language needed to challenge it. Inside the military, the ripple effects continued in ways command struggled to predict. Units stationed near civilian sectors reported increased refusal rates during morally ambiguous exercises. Not mutiny, but requests for clarification, demands for revised parameters, questions that had rarely been asked before. Officers trained to suppress emotional input found themselves confronted with recruits who cited ethics briefings and precedent cases rather than ideology. The Empire had always prized adaptability in combat scenarios, but it had never anticipated adaptability applied to conscience. Attempts to tighten discipline only highlighted the contrast between outdated assumptions and evolving reality. The human's role shifted again, not by decree, but by necessity. He was asked to consult on mediation protocols to provide insight into non-coercive conflict resolution, to explain how trust was built rather than enforced. Each request came with disclaimers emphasizing his unofficial status, yet his influence grew precisely because it remained unofficial. He was not defending a doctrine. He was describing lived experience, and that made his words harder to dismiss. Still, the pressure mounted. He worried that if he ever failed publicly, if he made a mistake large enough to harm the child or contradict his stated values, the backlash would be swift and unforgiving. The Dragon Bride reminded him again that fear of imperfection was itself a form of control, and that systems rarely changed because of flawless examples, but because of persistent human ones. A turning moment arrived when an Imperial Educational Council released a revised framework acknowledging voluntary allegiance as a legitimate developmental factor. The document was carefully worded, cautious, but its existence alone was seismic. It meant the Empire had, at least on paper, recognized that consent mattered even for those it had previously classified as dependents. Reaction was immediate. Supporters hailed it as overdue. Critics warned of chaos, and analysts scrambled to predict long-term effects. None of them could quantify the simplest truth, that once a system acknowledges choice, it cannot unacknowledge it. The dragon child, when the human explained the news in terms he could understand, shrugged and returned to his studies, unconcerned. To him, nothing had changed, because he had always believed his choice mattered. It was the adults who were only now catching up. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check. The first real test of the Empire's revised stance did not come from lawmakers or diplomats, but from a place far less predictable, a provincial sector court that had spent centuries handling minor jurisdictional disputes and trade violations. A case was filed there quietly, almost overlooked at first, involving a mixed-species household requesting formal recognition of a voluntary guardianship arrangement. Under the old system, it would have been dismissed automatically, rerouted, or buried in procedural delay. This time, the presiding magistrate hesitated. The new framework was vague, but it existed, and that single fact changed everything. For the first time, a local authority had room to interpret rather than simply enforce. News of the hearing spread faster than expected. Not through official channels, but through informal networks, community forums, and private message relays. That had learned long ago not to trust centralized announcements. Observers tuned in from across the Empire, some out of hope, others out of fear. The Empire tried to downplay the significance, framing it as an isolated administrative experiment. But the presence of legal scholars, cultural analysts, and even retired admirals watching from a distance made that claim ring hollow. Everyone understood that whatever decision came out of that courtroom would echo far beyond its walls. The human was asked to testify, not as an expert, but as a precedent. He resisted at first, aware of the risk, but the dragon bride pointed out something he had been avoiding, that silence now would not preserve safety. It would only preserve imbalance. When he finally stood before the court, he did not argue philosophy or policy. He described mornings, routines, disagreements, the slow, unremarkable process of building trust with a child who had every reason not to trust systems. He spoke about choice not as an abstract right, but as a daily practice, one that required consistency, accountability, and the willingness to accept rejection as a possible outcome. The simplicity of his words unsettled the room more than any dramatic declaration could have. Opposition testimony followed, citing historical stability, resource allocation, and the dangers of emotional governance. The arguments were polished, familiar, and logically sound within the Empire's traditional framework. Yet something about them felt outdated, as if they were answering a question no one was asking anymore. When the magistrate finally spoke, it was not with triumph or condemnation, but with careful clarity. The court recognized the guardianship provisionally, citing the revised educational framework and the demonstrated well-being of the dependent. It was a narrow ruling, deliberately limited, but it was real. A door that had been sealed for generations had cracked open. Reactions were immediate and divided. Some sectors celebrated openly, others tightened restrictions, fearing loss of control. The Empire issued a statement emphasizing that the ruling did not constitute universal precedent, but the words sounded defensive even to its own officials, because precedent had already been set, not legally perhaps, but psychologically. People had seen that the system could bend, and bending was enough to inspire movement. The dragon bride watched the broadcasts in silence, her expression unreadable. When the human asked what she thought, she answered honestly, saying that the Empire had taken its first step towards something dangerous, uncertainty. She did not mean dangerous in the way the council feared. She meant dangerous to hierarchies that relied on inevitability. Uncertainty allowed choice, and choice invited change, whether those in power were ready for it or not. That night, the dragon child asked a simple question, one that cut through every layer of policy and politics. He wanted to know why people were arguing so much about something that felt obvious to him. The human struggled to explain, eventually settling on the truth. that many beings had built their lives around rules that never asked what anyone wanted, and that changing those rules meant admitting they had been wrong. The child considered this, then said that being wrong did not seem like the worst thing, as long as you learned. It was a small statement, offered without drama, but it lingered in the air long after he went to sleep, because it carried the weight of a future the Empire could no longer ignore. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check. The Empire did not respond to the court's decision with force, at least not openly. Instead, it did what it had always done best when faced with something it could not immediately crush. It studied, categorized, and quietly recalibrated. Committees were formed under neutral names. Observational councils staffed with analysts trained to extract threat potential from cultural shifts. On paper, these groups existed to ensure stability. In practice, they were there to measure how far the idea of choice had already spread. Reports came back unsettling. Mixed households were no longer rare anomalies whispered about in fringe sectors. They were becoming visible, cautious, but unashamed, citing the provisional ruling as proof that the Empire itself no longer spoke with one unyielding voice. Within academic circles, the debate turned sharp and public. Sociologists argued that enforced compatibility had always masked inefficiencies, creating compliance without loyalty. Military historians countered that empires survived precisely because loyalty was unnecessary when obedience was guaranteed. The argument fractured old alliances between institutions that had stood together for centuries. Younger officials, especially those trained alongside humans or raised in frontier systems, began asking questions that would once have ended careers. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but persistently, the most dangerous kind of dissent. Why did stability require denying agency? Why did protection demand ownership? Why, after millennia of expansion, was the Empire still afraid of voluntary bonds? The Dragon Bride became an unwilling symbol in this ideological conflict. Media outlets requested interviews she never gave. Analysts dissected her expressions, from archived footage projecting motivations onto her silence. Some painted her as a victim who had adapted to survive. Others cast her as a manipulator undermining tradition from within. Neither narrative satisfied her because both stripped her of the same thing, authorship over her own life. When she finally agreed to speak, it was not to a major network or imperial channel, but to an independent educational archive used primarily by students. She spoke calmly, without accusation, describing the difference between being assigned a role and choosing a responsibility. She explained that tradition was not evil, but it became dangerous when it refused to justify itself to those forced to live under it. The ripple effect of her words was immediate among the younger generations. Enrollment in cultural exchange programs surged. Requests for voluntary reassignment increased, particularly among dependents nearing maturity. The Empire attempted to stem the flow by tightening procedural requirements, but every restriction only confirmed what many already suspected, that the system feared consent more than rebellion. Rebellion could be crushed. Consent had to be earned, and earning it required listening. Inside their home, life continued with an almost defiant normalcy. The human maintained routines, helped with studies, argued about chores, and learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to navigate dragon customs without exoticizing them. The dragon child grew more confident, not because he was told he was special, but because his choices were treated as real. He began asking about the Empire, not with fear, but curiosity, wanting to understand why something so vast could feel so fragile. Those conversations often ended without clear answers, but they planted something deeper than certainty, the habit of questioning power without assuming it was sacred. Toward the end of the cycle, an internal memo leaked from the High Continuity Council. It was not inflammatory, but it was revealing. The document acknowledged a measurable decline in passive compliance across multiple sectors and identified voluntary affiliation as a destabilizing variable. What alarmed analysts was not the data itself, but the recommendation at the end. Proposal to study human governance models more seriously, not as curiosities, but as potential templates. For the first time in recorded history, the Empire was not merely observing humanity from above. It was considering learning from them. When the human read the leaked report, he felt no triumph, only a quiet, uneasy understanding of what came next. Empires rarely changed gracefully. They adapted under pressure, often shedding old skins in painful ways. The Dragon Bride sensed this too. She said that moments like this were dangerous, not because of backlash, but because of opportunity. Opportunity invited actors who cared less about ethics and more about advantage. The future was opening, and not everyone stepping toward it would do so with good intentions. Still, neither of them suggested retreat. They had crossed the point where going back would only mean living smaller lives inside a larger lie. As the cycle closed, a formal summons arrived, sealed with imperial authority but phrased with unusual restraint. The High Council requested their presence, not for judgment, but for consultation. It was an invitation that would once have been unthinkable. The Dragon Child looked at the insignia, then at the two adults who had reshaped his understanding of belonging, and asked whether this meant they were finally being listened to. The human answered honestly, saying it meant the Empire was running out of ways not to. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check. The journey to the High Council's core world was nothing like the rigid transfers the Empire usually imposed. There were no armed escorts standing too close, no sealed compartments meant to remind travelers of their place. Instead, the transport felt almost deliberately neutral, as if the Empire itself was unsure how much authority it could still safely project. The Dragon Bride noticed it immediately. The way protocols softened at the edges, the way officials spoke in conditional language, rather than commands. To her, it felt less like respect and more like hesitation, a system aware that one wrong move might confirm every fear its critics had voiced. The human, accustomed to governments that argued openly and still functioned, recognized the same tension. Institutions caught between maintaining control and admitting change had already begun. When they arrived, the scale of the council chamber made even the Dragon Bride pause. It was designed to dwarf individuals, a reminder that personal stories were insignificant compared to imperial continuity. Yet something was different. The chamber was fuller than expected. Observers from multiple sectors present, including junior analysts, cultural delegates, and even representatives from protectorate worlds who rarely had standing in such sessions. The Empire was not just deciding something. It was watching itself decide. As they took their place, the human felt the weight of attention settle not like judgment, but like expectation. Whatever happened here would be replayed, analyzed, and argued over for generations. The High Council did not begin with accusations. Instead, they asked questions, many of them uncomfortable in their directness. They asked the Dragon Bride to explain the difference between duty and coercion, not in abstract philosophy, but in lived experience. They asked the human to describe how authority functioned in a society where leaders could be removed by the governed, and why that instability did not immediately lead to collapse. They questioned the child last, carefully, asking what he believed. His future looked like not what he had been taught to believe. His answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. He said he wanted to choose who he protected and who protected him, because anything else felt like fear pretending to be order. That statement fractured the room in ways no argument could. Some counselors reacted with visible discomfort. Their long-held assumptions exposed too quickly. Others leaned forward, listening with the intensity of beings who sensed history slipping its leash. The Empire had always defined itself as the ultimate protector. Yet here was a child raised under its authority, saying protection without choice felt hollow. Data streams lit up across the chamber as analysts ran projections in real-time, modeling what a system built on consent might cost and what it might save. The results were messy, contradictory, and deeply inconvenient. Outside the chamber, reaction was immediate and volatile. News feeds carried fragments of the testimony across systems, sometimes edited, sometimes distorted, but impossible to suppress entirely. Protests erupted in sectors long thought apathetic, not violent but persistent, citizens demanding representation in decisions that shaped their families. In response, traditionalist factions mobilized their own supporters, warning that the Empire was weakening itself by entertaining dangerous ideas. The tension did not explode into conflict, but it vibrated through every level of governance, a reminder that change, even peaceful change, threatened those invested in the old order. As deliberations dragged on, the human realized something unsettling. The council was not deciding whether to accept voluntary bonds. That decision had already been made by reality itself. What they were deciding was whether the Empire would guide the transition or be dragged through it. The Dragon Bride sensed it too, the quiet desperation beneath the formal debate. Empires could survive losing territory. Losing legitimacy was far more dangerous. When the council finally adjourned for private discussion, there was no sense of closure, only the awareness that whatever emerged would redefine power across the stars. That night, in temporary quarters overlooking the artificial horizon of the core world, the Dragon Bride admitted something she had never said aloud. She was afraid, not of punishment, but of success. If the Empire changed, truly changed, then the burden of responsibility would spread to those who had demanded it. Freedom required participation, vigilance, and the willingness to accept consequences. The human understood. Choice was not a gift, it was a commitment. And somewhere beyond the glowing arc of the station, entire civilizations were beginning to realize they had been given one whether they were ready or not. Years later, historians would argue about the exact moment everything changed. Some would point to first contact treaties, others to the collapse of the old galactic hierarchies. But those who knew the truth always traced it back to a single, quiet decision made in a place no one had been watching closely enough. The Dragon Bride never returned to her people, not because she was trapped, but because she chose to stay. And her son grew up straddling two worlds, carrying fire in his blood and something far rarer in his heart, a human sense of choice. When the wider galaxy finally learned what had happened, that a supposedly inferior species had not only been chosen, but had been trusted, the reaction was not outrage, it was fear, because for the first time, humanity was no longer being evaluated as a resource or a liability, but as a partner capable of reshaping futures. And somewhere among the stars, the quiet understanding spread that Earth was no longer a world you could bargain over, trade from, or threaten lightly, because it had become a place where even dragons had learned to call home. And that is where this chapter ends, not with a battle, not with a conquest, but with a choice that echoed farther than any war ever could. If you enjoyed this story and want more human-first science fiction where courage, connection, and unexpected bonds change the galaxy, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. And let me know in the comments which part of the story stayed with you the most. I'd love to see what moments stood out for you.